Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. Hi everyone. Just a little note to mention that the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra meditation app is now available on the Apple Store and the Google Play Store. We haven't made a big announcement about it yet because we are still ironing out very minor bugs, but it is almost perfectly functional, and you can get it in the App Store, and we will do a wide release probably in a month from now. For this episode of the podcast, we dig deep into the archives and feature an interview conducted in 2016. And here I'm being interviewed by Stuart Goodnick and Dr. Robert Schmidt of the Mystical Positivist podcast. And this podcast is one of the longest running podcasts around. It's also a radio show. It's been going since 2011. And I'll read their blurb about it. The Mystical Positivist is dedicated to the application of reason in the pursuit of spiritual practice and development. It consists of commentary, book reviews, interviews, and discussion in and around the larger spiritual community. The thesis of the show is that rationality is in no way the antithesis of deep mystical experience. In fact, we assert that it is a necessary ally. So you can see why I was interested to connect with these guys. And we did a two-part interview back in 2016. I was certainly younger and less experienced then, but I think there's some wisdom here. And so this is part one of that interview. Enjoy.
Hareesh, welcome to the Mystical Positivist.
Thank you. Well, it's great to have you here, and we will begin as we usually begin these conversations by asking you about early experiences from earliest childhood onwards that you could say, looking back, prefigured the direction that your life and work would take and your interests would take. So if something pops up,
well, I'm glad I have something to report then. I find that mystical experiences like visions and things are sort of constitutional. Some people get them and some people don't. And so I'm one of those people that my spiritual progress is generally not marked by mystical visions of any kind. But this really remarkable thing happened when I was, I want to say 7 or 8. And my dad had just visited this meditation center for the first or second or third time, and he brought home a cassette tape of Om Namah Shivaya chanting, and he put that on, and I was lying down, and for the moment I heard it, my eyes closed, and I went inside, which had never happened to me before as a kid, and I had this vision, like a full-on vision, like, fully visual. And it was a being, a beautiful, compassionate, powerful being made entirely of blue light, shimmering, iridescent blue light. And to me, he kind of looked like Gandalf the Master Wizard. Because I knew the story of the Hobbit as a kid, And, but he was made entirely of blue light. He has a beard and staff and so on, and just a powerful presence. And, that was totally spontaneous, and as a kid, I'm like, oh, that's cool. So imagine my surprise years later when reading Swami Muktananda's autobiography, Play of Consciousness, and he describes the exact vision, having this Nila Purusha in Sanskrit, this vision of the being of blue light. And but what was also fascinating to me in reflecting on this experience is that Muktananda saw a being of blue light who looked like an Indian guru, kind of a stereotypical Indian guru, and I saw a being of blue light who kind of looked like Gandalf. And that struck me as deeply significant later, because it was the same in form but slightly different in content, and the content was clearly determined by the mental conditioning of the people having the experience. Same being of radiant blue light, but the form, or the specific form, was, looked different to him and to me,
or interpreted differently. Sure.
Right, but it's as if the Shakti, the spiritual energy, takes the form that matches something you have in your mind. And in reflection, I was like, well, at 8 years old, Gandalf was literally the closest thing I knew to like a guru or a being of great wisdom. Mm-hmm. He was the only paradigm I had, and it was like the same Shakti, but it kind of has to, and that kind of shaped my reflection on mysticism, is that, there's this cultural element, or the being filtered through the mind, but at the same time, there's this transcultural element, because I had this experience with absolutely no prior conditioning. So that seemed significant.
So how did that experience then play out for you? I mean, was it like a data point that suddenly rose later in its significance, or did it have a impact on you at 9 years old?
No, it didn't have an impact. It's at the time. It was like, the one way I interpreted it was like this, the Shakti, for lack of a better term, spiritual energy, sort of giving me a little signal or heads up of what would be significant later. Mm-hmm. Because, 9 years after that experience as a teenager, then I had a sort of Shaktipat awakening, and started spiritual practice seriously at the age of 16. And only then, 16 or 17, did I look back to that experience, which I actually always remembered, but didn't seem that significant before.
I see, but then it sort of resonated later as you got deeper into it.
Yeah, and it was only then as a teenager that, as I said, I looked in that book and I was like, holy cow, the blue being.
So what was the instigation for this decision in your mid-teens to take up spiritual practice?
Well, I was tricked into it, actually. My mom was really into meditation. She had gotten more into meditation than my dad by that point, and she really wanted me to have that experience of meditation or whatever, like parents just wanting you to be in their religion or something. And she was like, come to a meditation intensive at this ashram. And I really had no interest, but she bribed me. She was like, well, if you do that, I'll pay for your trip to New York and you can see theater, because at the time I was mainly into theater. And so I did it just as a means to an end, I thought. So that's another interesting thing to me, is that, I use the word grace to mean like the thing that comes to you, the spiritual thing that comes to you that you're not seeking or wanting. You're not psyching yourself into it. So I went to this meditation intensive. I just have to sit through this BS.
To get to New York.
And then at the very end of that weekend, I just walked out in the final meditation, just like in all the other meditations. Nothing really happened except I sort of got a little bit quiet inside. But then when I opened my eyes and walked out of the meditation hall at the very end, I was experiencing reality fundamentally differently. And there are a couple elements to that. For one thing, everything seemed more vivid and clear and bright and sparkly a little bit. Like I'd finally rubbed the sleep from my eyes, sort of thing. And the other main thing I noticed was this feeling of connection to all other beings, to everyone I could see around me. And I felt this, like these almost like lines of energy connecting my heart to everyone else's heart, invisible lines of energy. And I noticed they were just as strong with the people I didn't like as the ones I liked. And there was something significant about that somehow.
Strong in the sense that it was undifferentiated in terms of like and dislike.
In terms of preference. Yeah. That there are these just my heart was connected to all other beings, whether I liked it or not, as it were, you know. And the third element to the experience was this, was love, you know, just waves of love, the heart sort of opening for the first time. I mean, I didn't even know really what it meant to have an open heart before that, I think. And I felt not only more love than I had ever felt, but more than I could imagine was possible, you know. And of course the usual thing of just a kind of a sense of unity. And so, you know, that the tradition of Tantric Shaivism, which I, you know, came to study in depth later, uses the word Shaktipat to describe this initial awakening, where it's almost like you get a taste of where the whole spiritual path is headed right up front, so you know what the point is.
So did this experience then and this quality of perception fade after that point? Was there how long did it persist?
Sure. Well, it did persist. I don't remember how long. You know, it slowly faded, only to recur at intervals. You know, and so for a long time I was fixated, as I think many people in the spiritual life are, on experience, on having experiences, on getting high, as it were, without the drugs. And finally, only much later did I come to realize, or you might say have a further awakening, because it's like a series of awakenings, you might say, in the spiritual life, and that it wasn't really about that. That really what mattered and what I became interested in is a fundamental shift of the default state, rather than highs or peak experiences, you know. And so, and that I think really changed the character of my spiritual life. And
that later insight you're saying?
Yeah, to getting off the fixation on spiritual experience and even bliss, and on to what I call just the shift of the default state, where I'm at with no special stimulus and no mystical experience, the normal state, no longer inhabiting self-images or an ego structure. You know, so I realized only much later, in my 30s really, that a lot of spirituality, a lot of my spirituality had been about replacing the previous ego structure with a new, more spiritual ego structure, and that's not true awakening, that's not true freedom.
So this is an interesting point, and I'd maybe like your observations on the contemporary spiritual scene. You know, certainly what you've seen in Northern California or what you see even now in Boulder. My impression is that that's a pretty standard relationship that people have, even with the best of intentions, to their spiritual work. And I'm just curious, how you see that as a fairly common thing? Do you see
very common all over? I mean, I teach all over for the last 5 to 10 years, 5 years especially, all over the world, all over North America, certainly South America as well. And I think it's just a human phenomenon that what happens is you get involved in the spiritual life, you have insights, you have realizations, you have experiences, and the ego can co-opt virtually anything, you know? Right. So and if the insight then gets integrated into your ego structure, that manifests in various ways, like as dogmatic attachment to it as a belief. And I think beliefs are very different from insights, right? Because beliefs are clinging to static thought forms instead of spontaneous intimacy with the current situation. As well as forming self-images of oneself as a spiritual person, and thereby suppressing aspects of the personality that don't fit with the spiritual self-image. Like, oh, I'm not allowed to be angry or sad or whatever your community sort of identifies as evidence that you're not that spiritual.
Or even what you think your community identifies.
Sure, absolutely. It can be projection, or it can be, I mean, I think communities do have systemic issues of that nature where subtle demonization of certain emotions that cause suppression instead of integration of those emotions.
Right.
You know, so all of that is a problem, and what I've found, not a problem, right? Because it is what naturally happens, but that's why I think there has to be a kind of relentless focus on the truth and not resting on one's laurels, as it were, in this process for it to really gel. But what I've found as a teacher is that the ones who have lived in a spiritual lifestyle or community for the longest time sometimes are the ones hardest to teach.
Is that because they've created a lived identity, a kind of and replicated that identity thoroughly in their lives around being in this community, being a practitioner?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and it's hard to take to suddenly be fresh.
Right, and I think Shinryo Suzuki in the Zen tradition was so wise when he talked about beginner's mind, and that the key to the whole thing is that if you're not, if you view yourself as an advanced practitioner, that is absolutely an obstacle in spiritual practice, right? Because being able to revisit the most basic practices fresh, I think that's absolutely key. I define ego as self-image, or connected series of self-images. And what I see is that it's, for human beings, the most comfortable possible thing is to live inside of a self-image, because to not do so feels raw, feels vulnerable. It requires embracing unknowing. Unknowing's uncomfortable until you really get acclimated to it, however long that takes. And so, and if their goal is happiness over and against truth, which they would have to self-reflect to see if that's really the case. But, if someone's goal is happiness over and against truth, then a shiny, improved spiritual ego is sort of just what the doctor ordered. Right. Replacing one ego with, and refining it over time. But the spiritual, but awakeness is not the result of refinement.
Well, that's an interesting distinction there, because it suggests that awakeness is transformational, or sort of a significant state change, as opposed to a process of refining a jewel, or rubbing off the hard edges. In fact, spiritual egos are actually, in some respects, like a personality that's been rubbed very fine and is beautiful and shiny.
Exactly, and therefore all the harder to transcend an ego which has been so improved. The self-improvement project. But I'm just speaking, of course, from point of view of the yogic traditions and tantric traditions that I'm immersed in. But the whole thing is that which you fundamentally are, your essence, nature, needs no refinement, needs no improvement, and the mind and body can be endlessly worked on and will never be perfect in terms of our abstract, cultural sense of the word perfection. So it's like what's really going on here. That's in a number of blogs I make this argument, because it's so ill understood, I think, that spirituality, at least in a yogic sense, is not a self-improvement project in any way. It's about dropping out of this imaginary self that gets constructed by society and you and co-creation, and dropping into something much deeper, something that can't really be said adequately in words. And then allowing the organic, if it wants to happen, allowing the organic transformation of the ego structure and personality as a just natural byproduct of abiding in your deeper nature. And yes, there's some work involved because you have to, kind of do some self-reflection and kind of look at some things you might not want to admit about your own ego or mind, right? But the more you abide in essence nature, I find the easier that is, because the less identified you are with the ego, the more willing you are to look at it and see, wow, that's up right there.
Right.
I don't know if you allow swearing.
We don't.
I don't have a problem, but although the FCC might, I'm not sure.
Okay.
That's right. Say whatever you wish. I'm just writing down the time.
Restate it. I'll just restate it. What I'm talking about is the ability to look at your ego and acknowledge where there's hang-ups, acknowledge where there's psychological issues, but not take it personally.
Right.
Just like you learn in spiritual maturity not to take other people's view of you personally. You don't take it personally that your own mind is messed up in various ways, if we want to use that phrase, but it's got its hang-ups, it's got its issues, but so does everyone, and you don't take it personally, because if you're abiding in essence nature, it's like there's this kind of love almost, or willingness to embrace human imperfection and not feel shame about it, because there's also this aspect of my being which is inherently perfect, which is not the personality.
Right. I did say, so there's a couple of things in that I want to ask. One is there's maybe a practical question about, in a way, it's sort of like what do they say about the old joke about the Seamen's Union? In order to be a member of the Seamen's Union, you have to go to sea. In order to go to sea, you have to be a member of the Seamen's Union.
Yeah.
And in a way, the clarity, the psychological system needs to have enough spaciousness in it in order to permit the descending into a deeper state. A deeper state of, as you described it, of getting into touch with your essential being. From there, then the psychological structure can start to respond to the abiding in that state. But the question I guess I have is how do you get into that? How do you get the psychological structure, which is so resilient, the egoic structure, so resilient in co-opting any element of experience into its own narrative, to subside sufficiently in order to permit a direct experience of a more fundamental aspect of one's being, such that a connection can be made and there can begin a process of, let's say, loosening, if you will, the egoic shackles?
Yeah. I think this is one of the big mysteries. The tradition that I study just talks about it in terms of maturing or ripening, as the metaphor they use, that at a certain point, and certainly reading spiritual teachings and so on can perhaps help hasten this a little bit. Getting interested in the deeper truth can help hasten this. But ultimately, it's a matter of kind of reaching a certain point of maturity where you're just not as interested in shoring up the ego or defending it or explaining it or justifying it as you are in that which lies beyond. Another way to put it is from what I think is, in my experience and what I've seen, is meditation really starts working only when the meditator is more interested in what lies beyond thought than in the contents of thought. As long as you're fascinated by your own thoughts, it's just not really going to happen in any substantial way. It's like there has to be this curiosity and fascination with that which lies beyond, with that which is deeper. So I think that what we call the ego, which is really a series of interrelated thoughts that are believed, only loosens its grip when we stop giving energy to those thoughts, and of course it doesn't grip us, we grip it, but it feels like it grips us, right?
So in a sense, then the practice of meditation is a expression of, or a practice of, an intention to move one's attention to something other than the contents of thinking.
Yeah.
And with sufficient time and cultivation, it's been your experience that in itself will permit a kind of a ripening where a natural deepening will take place, such that there is progressively greater access to an experience of one's essential self, and maybe as that deepens, the process accelerates. But
but one thing I just want to nuance that you said is that, that there has to be some clarity in the psyche or the mind or the ego in order to drop into essence nature. And I think that's usually true, but not always. Because there are cases of people who, even with fragmented, distorted, and traumatized psyches, for God only knows what reason, past life karma, who knows what, they just encounter this possibility and bam, they drop in. Then the danger becomes that it turns into a form of escapism or disassociation for them, because it can be so blissful to rest in one's essence nature.
Or even fetishism, it seems to me.
Sure.
A fetishized state.
Yeah, and that is a hazard, but I don't want to say that it's a rule that you have to do a certain amount of psychological work before you can drop in.
So let me ask you, you've focused on meditation, but I'm thinking of the admonitions frequently repeated, for example, in the Pali Suttas in Buddhism, about who you hang out with, basically. And I'll ask that in terms of the general point and ask you to respond about that, but also maybe you could also bring that back to your own experience. I mean, you just talked about this experience at 17 or whatever, however old you were, happened after a weekend, hanging out with people who were focused in a particular direction.
And I don't know that I would attribute causality to that per se, but I certainly think that most people, including me, find it very difficult, or found it very difficult, to sustain spiritual work and spiritual inquiry without the support of community, without being around like-minded people, definitely. I mean, there are some who can do it, who are just these lone wolves who are like, I don't know what enlightenment is, but I'm going for that no matter what. I don't care who's with me. But for the most part, I think we need community, and then that raises another kind of challenge, which is you get attached to your community, and then, if at a certain point if you're really doing the inquiry, and you notice a lot of people in the community are kind of like, they've gotten into their nice little groove, and they're not wanting to do kind of this critical inquiry anymore, and progress in that way. And then the whole thing of like moving on from the community, which certainly happened for me in some ways. Not to say that community was bad or anything, but just that like I felt at a certain point to go further. The community should give me so much love and support. I actually had to move on, and and so I think the process of spiritual awakening, whatever we're calling it, spiritual liberation, it stalls if that thirst for truth gets superseded by anything else, really.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying about the dynamics of human social interactions having a kind of inertia, tending to have a kind of inertia that can provide that obstacle, and that makes perfect sense. And it's certainly one of the things that I see communities struggle with, in the lives of friends and so forth. So that makes sense. And I think I heard you say that, and correct me to the extent I'm mistaken here, I think I heard you say that you had to move on because there was a certain context established where your own further self-examination was not supported. Is that basically right?
Yes. These things are, of course, really subtle, And in many spiritual communities that are not cults and that are not particularly unhealthy, that, you know, there's these subtle dynamics in value systems in which you know, people can find a sort of comfortable way of not fully walking the talk and not acknowledging that, you know. So in that particular community, you know, non-duality was allegedly the teaching. And, you know, as I kind of maintained my faculties of critical inquiry, which not everyone does, I was like, you know, this isn't really, like, the values of non-duality are being paid lip service to a certain degree, to a certain extent, because if you're really non-dual, you permit and even encourage freedom of expression, diversity of opinion, as opposed to very subtly encouraged consensus that sort of and discouragement, again, that not by telling anyone you can't say that, but various forms of subtle discouragement of diversity of view or diversity of self-expression. And you know, I think so. Yeah, there's I think it's hard to parse these issues in a fully accurate way because they are very subtle,
and they're also personal and individual, it seems to me, as well,
yeah,
given the specific circumstances and experiences of the people involved.
And the other key thing really was that this was a community, as I think many spiritual communities, that talks about liberation or enlightenment or awakening in a vague sort of way, but there's not a common shared value of being really serious about that's attainable in this lifetime, and we're going for it, you know, and I can understand why, because if that's the discourse, that's so easily co-opted into a kind of bizarre cultish mentality. But still, at the same time, I didn't want to screw around. I wanted to, if enlightenment was real, I don't actually prefer that term anymore, but I wanted to experience that. And if people around me weren't serious about it, you know, I wanted to find some people who were, you know, and you know, I still greatly value the teachings of that community and my first guru who gave me so much love and empowerment and encouragement and support, you know.
So I'm interested, you know, that there's a interesting distinction here with the description of the community, because on the one hand, there are the members of the community, and I can understand there being a range of expressions or clarity about whether, you know, and commitment as to whether they're really looking for comfort in a community or looking for radical self-honesty. But what about the teacher in the community? I mean, the person who, you know, the guru in the community who's providing the training, the teaching, the context. Are you suggesting that there comes a point where maybe even the relationship with the guru shifts because you've gotten what you are able to get from that particular person, and something from a different angle needs to come in? How do you see that?
Yeah, I definitely think there's some truth to that. You know, the guru in this particular community, you know, there's in Indian spiritual communities, and this is an Indian guru we're talking about, there's these certain cultural constraints. And I think of course she never said this, but I think she felt necessarily constrained by the paradigm that had already been established by her guru before her. And she has made a lot of changes in that community from the way her guru did it, but very slowly over a long period of time, so it doesn't sort of directly contradict. And so, and she's very kind of innovative and modern in her thinking, but still kind of operating within this particular cultural framework. So yeah, I mean, I think there's an idea in the tantric tradition that you have a root guru, and then you have other gurus that help you kind of fully unfold what you receive from your root guru. And for me, that was true more energetically than philosophically, like that I received a kind of transmission of energy and unconditional love and power from her, but that I wasn't able to fully embody it or actualize it or even fully just grok, what this was really all about until I met some other teachers who also became friends and who just, they came at just the right time where like things that I had read about and heard about and contemplated for years and I thought I understood was like, bam, like, oh my God, I was living previously in a mental construct of these non-dual ideas, and projecting them onto the world, and not actually in the non-conceptual direct experience. So, there were a couple of such teachers. One of them was Adyashanti, who's active today and is a wonderful guy, a wonderful human being as well, and I've been fortunate to sit with him. And somehow, even though he came from this totally different background of Zen Buddhism, with a little dose of Christian mysticism, that's his thing, right? Totally different background, but had kind of reached the point in his own process that goes beyond, sect and cultural difference of tradition. And so that, just getting it from that totally different angle really helped everything gel for me, So I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, well, but actually it does. That's a precise answer to the question. I'm also interested in the distinction that you just rose, because this comes up, and we've had conversations with friends of ours in the Tibetan tradition along these same lines of particularly the relationship to non-duality and how you realized at one point that what you had was a mental conception of non-duality that you were projecting onto your experience versus an immediate experience of non-conceptual relationship or being.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in there's two sub-questions here. One is, since you earlier said that as your process has progressed, that you're not, that it's less about special effects or experiences, is this something that's in a different category than special effect and experience? And can you talk about this distinction and how that shifted for you?
Yeah, I can talk about it a little bit, but it's very hard to talk about this because this is where the English language tends to break down. Because what I discovered and have corroborated with other teachers of this subject is that awakeness is not an experience, it's a mode of being. Non-duality, if we want to call it that, it's not really an experience. I mean, when it first hits you, it can have an experiential element, but it's really not an experience, it's a mode of being. It's a context within which experience occurs, as opposed to being an experience itself. And that, I think, is really key, because all experiences come and go, without exception. There's no experience that could last forever. So when the traditions, the Asian spiritual traditions talk about, kind of a kind of permanent shift, whether it's mistranslated in my view as enlightenment or some other term, they're not talking about an experience, because that's impossible,
So they're talking about a context.
A mode of being or a context for experience, those are the closest terms I've been able to come up with. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess the way I would understand that, or the way I would access that from the experiential realm, is one might expect that the nature of one's experience, as different things happen to you, will be different operating out of that context than operating out of a dual context.
Yeah, I think. But the interesting thing is, different constitutions. I think there's different experiential flavor to what's fundamentally the same. You know, it's fundamentally the same because the non-dual mode of being is one in which, having subtracted the projection of mental constructs such as me versus you, you know, mine versus yours, good versus bad, or those are all just the basic ones, right? But everything, ultimately, the whole house of cards has to fall apart. And if you're not projecting the mental constructs, the interpretations of reality onto reality, non-duality is the true non-duality is what happens, where you land when you just subtract all those projections. In other words, there are no divisions in reality whatsoever. So you dissolve the belief system that in which division seems real, and then you naturally dwell in non-division. And what I've found is different people can have kind of a different way of experiencing that. And it's, again, hard to talk about the really subtle experiential element, but for me, the non-dual mode is one in which, I always feel completely at home wherever I am, but B, also that it, and this is sort of hard to describe, but somehow feels like everything, it feels like everything is internal. Nothing is external. There is no external. Everything is internal to what I am, but what I am referring, of course, not to the ego, but to this deeper being that's not only me, but everyone. So everything's internal to what I am, and somehow, for lack of a better term, held. Like everything is held, everything is embraced, which makes sort of no sense to my rational mind. And just trying to give words to this feeling sense that somehow everything is just perfectly held, and that is a flavor of experience that maybe other people have too, you know. But I've talked to some other folks, and I don't know, maybe it's that I'm not far enough along or something, but who have different flavors of experience, you know. Like this one guy who, he's definitely abiding in non-dual awareness, and he experiences like that all the kind of, even the physical things of this world have been sort of hollowed out and have become insubstantial, and everything seems only as substantial as wisps of dream stuff, you know. And I don't have that flavor of experience quite, but I understand what he's saying, because there's a way in which, even though everything's real, everything's a dream too, because it's all internal to consciousness. You know, there's no, I agree with him, this particular guy, who's got a really cool blog called Uncovering Life. And I agree with him that there's no objective reality and that everything is internal to consciousness, but he has a different flavor to the experience, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, it's interesting, because what was coming up for me is in my own practice, if I look at transitions that I've experienced at different places, that one thing I've noted that in certain categories of activities and experiences, that it's very clear that emotional reactivity doesn't operate. You know, sometimes there are other areas where I'm very clear that it is operating, and I can see that, but it's not. But areas where, for instance, something happens, you know, or maybe you're sitting at the death of a loved one, or you know, when in the business world, I'm a manager. Someone comes up to me and says they're resigning.
Yeah.
What's interesting is sometimes that there's just a complete it's like what I would call acceptance or radical acceptance of what's being presented in this moment.
Yeah, non-reactivity, yeah.
And I find that that's arising in a context, to use the language that you're using. And so I understand that the way I access what you're saying is that there's a very different context that's operating for me than operated at a different time in my life, at different stages of practice, and that within that context, then my processes of experiences is different, and I'm not actively repeating to myself, everything's consciousness, everything's gone.
Yeah.
I'm not, it's like, if I stub my toe, I don't, say, it's all one, go, and go away. I essentially, that conceptual modality doesn't have to arise, because the nature of the change in experience is more a function of the context I'm inhabiting.
That's absolutely key, because if you need the thought, it's still a belief, not you see what I mean? If you have to remind yourself everything's consciousness, then what you're experiencing is the good feelings that arise from believing that.
Yeah, and part of my sense of teasing this out is because in our fourth way tradition, there's a lot of focus on the model of three centers: the mental moving center, the emotional or feeling center, and then the physical or kind of body center. Mm-hmm. I think those have very clear corollaries in tantric tradition. So,
although just to briefly mention, the key distinction is three centers, one being more physical, the second being thoughts and emotions intertwined, and the third being pure awareness.
Okay.
So it's a different way of drawing the boundaries, I guess.
Yeah, and where I was going with that is that there's often, I noticed with people in certain spiritual traditions, that there'll be a lot of work on the mental level, so that there'll be, you'll maybe even have some control over thoughts that are arising, or can get behind the thoughts and things like that. But there are emotional habit patterns that often are expressed in the body, or catch people off guard, where all of a sudden the best laid plans of a spiritual ego fragment in the face of a real emotional threat.
Absolutely.
And it's that transformation at the emotional level that I find. In some traditions, they talk about wisdom descending into the heart, which is how I would those words work for me for that. But that's an important part of the process. Some traditions, like my recollection of my work with my teacher, was that the way he functioned for me was to create series of shocks at that emotional level, so that my reactivity was always constantly on display, and it was not a comfortable process.
But you could look at it.
Yeah, I had even I could see it. Yeah, and I think that was much of your experience as well.
Sure.
And so I'm kind of, that seemed like an integral part of the process, and I guess maybe I'm kind of coming around to the question that was that kind of training in that way part of your own process, or and do you see that as a necessary part of achieving this kind of context shift that we're talking about?
Yes, it's a necessary part of achieving an integrated version of this context shift, because there's a couple of ways this can happen, right? You can have the flip back and forth experience, where you can flip into non-dual and non-conceptual, non-verbal awareness. But then when you're interacting with human beings, for which you have to use your mind and language, you flip into your unintegrated ego self. And a lot of people, I think, are experiencing that and are frustrated by it. And the integration work is challenging, but ultimately it doesn't feel satisfying to flip back and forth between two versions of yourself, even if one is infinitely bliss-filled and contented, because you don't want to just be escaping. And
actually, it's fascinating you say that, because we had a long discussion on our show a few years ago with John Wellwood, and we were having this kind of disconnect, because our spiritual training really, with our teacher, it was like a 24/7 kind of live-in situation, and it wasn't just transcendence work. It was this kind of gritty, emotional reactivity work. For him, he was more used to what I'd call weekend Buddhism or retreat Buddhism, where there was a context in which you really could create the space for a non-dual transcendent experience. But his whole body of work was about bringing psychological training to help with the integration, because he felt like those traditions didn't really have as much of a express methodology for dealing with that. And then when we finally kind of parsed that out, it became clear, okay, when you say, it is true, you can flip back and forth, and then there's psychological work that can help with the integration.
Sure.
There's also methodologies in which those things are sort of done at the same time, and the flavor of the distinction.
It seems to give it a different character, but actually, it's are you integrating everything as you go along, or are you doing a big chunk of kind of, let's go deep into the ground of being or the transcendent absolute, and then spend a while integrating it, And so, I think to me, it's a more ideal situation to be sort of integrating on a daily basis. But since I and other teachers encounter a lot of people who've done kind of this meditational work, and now they need to do a big chunk of integrational work, and they need to be willing to be humble enough, because that's the thing. If I'm an advanced meditator is their thing, they're not. They resist the integration.
So let me then ask. I mean, we haven't really. We've used the word tantra has arisen a few times in the conversation. Tell us about your work with tantric Shaivism, and in regard to this question that has just come up about integration.
Yeah. Well, it's actually fascinating because they didn't have psychology then, but they really had some amazing insights that were very prescient, considering they had no system or context to fit those into, like psychology. One thing is that the integration work is not very effective if you have the wrong motive. So there's this teaching in both Tantric Shaivism and Tantric Buddhism about pure motive, where the pure motive, unfortunate word in English, that's just a direct translation, it really means effective motive. So the pure motive is you're doing the work out of love for yourself and in service to all beings. The impure motive is there's something wrong with me as I am, I better fix it or no one will like me. Or whatever version of that you have, right? So if the impure motive of something wrong with me as I am that needs to be fixed, the integration cannot sort of complete or pass a certain stage, So that's one element that they presented in the tradition, which I think is really crucial. That true integration can't proceed on the basis of a concealed form of self-hatred.
And you were getting that early from your first introduction
No, there was no clear pure motive teaching. It was sort of it was sort of there in a vague sense, but only when I got into tantra properly. Classical tantra, of course, I mean not neo tantra or American sacred sexuality type tantra, which really scholars simply regarded at this point as a homonym. These are just two different words in two different languages that happen to sound the same, basically. The English word tantra and the Sanskrit word tantra. So in classical tantra, we have this pure motive and so I had to, the community that I was a part of was quoted tantric teachings, non-dual tantric teachings, but wasn't very that involved in it. So anyway, I came to that teaching later, and it was really powerful. For me.
Was it when you say you came to that teaching, was this on a personal experiential level as well as sort of finding the expressions of the teaching in words?
One of the sort of upagurus I mentioned, I had several teachers, I would say mainly three main figures who helped me understand what had already been sort of pointed to, and to deepen and contextualize and bring in sort of key elements that allowed things to gel. So another one of these upaguru type figures transmitted the pure motive teaching to me, and it was a game changer.
Was it a game changer because you recognize elements of your relationship to your work that had impure motives, and elements that had
he
pure?
outlined the three main impure motives, and this is all detailed in my blog now, but the three main impure motives and how it's like, and the thing is, this ripening thing, right? I was ripe for the teaching. I was like overripe almost. So when it landed, it was like bam, 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 bam. Stuff could just click into place, and I could see, well, that's why that hasn't clicked. I have a subtle version of that impure motive over there, and that one over there. You know, briefly, it's thinking there's something wrong with you that needs to be fixed. Being attached to spiritual highs or you know, the feel good aspect of the path, and then the third impure motive being sort of power over others or invested in charisma as a teacher. That more applies to teachers, really.
Right.
So, and then the pure motive is walking the path out of love for yourself with a desire to know the truth, whether it feels good or not, and for the benefit of all beings. So those three elements of the pure motive counter the three impure motives I just mentioned.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga practices, guided meditations, and much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Paula Chamas. New episodes drop every other week. And may all beings benefit.